Well, when Parliament next sits, 8 days from now, there'll be a very different Senate, 12 new senators, and the Greens will hold the balance of power in their own right. With that in mind, our guest here in the studio this morning is the Greens leader, Bob Brown. But before then, we'll take a look at the papers around the country. And yesterday, duelling tax cuts on either side of the country was seemed to be the main political story in the papers this morning, Karen.
That's right, Barry. Both sides, both major parties offering tax cuts into the future, and the message from Tony Abbott is that his tax cuts won't have a carbon tax, so you'll get tax cuts without having to worry about the compensation from the carbon tax, which is a simple way of putting it. The government is saying that they expect that they'll need to compensate about $500 a year per household if they go with a $20 a tonne carbon tax. Julie Gillard's saying 9 out of 10 households would be compensated. $150,000 a year is around about the cut-off. But they're talking about couples on $128,000 with 3 kids being able to potentially double dip, get tax cuts, but also get a rise in family payments. So they're attempting to be extremely generous and convince people that they will not be worse off under a carbon tax.
So what Tony Abbott's doing here, Phil, is saying, well, if I withdraw the carbon tax, the government's going to say, well, now you'll have to withdraw the compensation as well. And he's like, I'll do that, but I'll replace it with my own tax cuts.
Look, he's setting up an arguing point in advance. When they announce the compo, it's going to be difficult for him to say, I'm going to take pensions, take money back off pensioners and tax cuts. So don't worry, I'll give you a tax cut regardless. Slight problem how you're going to pay for it. I mean,
well, yeah, we know how the government's paying for it. They're paying it through the carbon tax.
And look,
without it.
Yeah, the tax cuts the government's giving you are not because they just want to give you a tax cut. It's actually to help you cope with it's part of the policy, if you like. So, rule of thumb, it's going to cost about $6 billion a year in household compensation. So Abbott's essentially going to match that in kind, but he hasn't got the revenue, so he's got to find at least $6 billion. You're talking $24 billion over the forward estimates. What he's done, he's rolled this line out to head off the inevitable attacks that are going to come in the next few weeks from the government. So you're going to really take this money back off the people we're going to give them? I mean, there's a story we had a couple of weeks ago where some of his front benches and some very senior front benches are already aware of this problem. They've been urging him to junk his paid parental leave policy, which is $3.1 billion a year that would raise. Just collect the revenue, but give it to pensioners.
Well,
so he might do that.
He's got to look for $6 billion and saving. That's a lot. You could start with your own spending.
Well, you pick $6 billion, but he's got to find some money. I think it's smart politics. He's got to be able to say that the Labor Party, the Gillard plan is a big government tax and churn system, and he'll axe that. But of course, he'll have some sort of tax cuts there. I expect they'll be relatively modest. They'll be less than what Labor's churning through the system, but it does blunt that attack for him, I think. And he'll just have to, well, not Tony actually, Andrew Robb and Joe Hockey will have to find some savings.
Fellas, can you?
Well, need to be at least, I think, about $10 billion for a decent-sized tax cut. So that's a lot of savings.
Well, yes, so $6 billion in this case, if all you're doing is matching what Julie Gillard's doing in compensation.
Principally, it gives him a slogan, tax cuts without a carbon tax.
Yeah.
And,
well, he needs another one of those, does he?
Well.
OK, the Liberal presidency, Chris, was decided yesterday. Alan Stockdale beat Peter Reith, 57 votes to 56.
It's as narrow as it gets, Barry. One vote, of course, and we're told that Tony Abbott, of course, voted for Stockdale. So in the end, he got his man.
Well, we know that he did because he showed Alan Stockdale his voting paper. He wouldn't have done that otherwise.
Indeed, and there are some people in the party wondering why he encouraged Peter Reith to run, given that he backed Stockdale. But look, in the end, I suppose Tony felt because there was so much contention over this, he'd stick with the incumbent. So, look, it's an interesting little battle on the sidelines, bringing back some of the old big names of the Liberal Party, Alexander Downer, Nick Minchin, Peter Reith. But in the end, it was much ado about nothing, and they sail on now and try and put this behind it.
Although, it was a bruising exercise, though, wasn't it, for the status quo?
Yeah, and the reason it came about was that there's concern about the party's finances and the way they are managed, their capacity to raise money, and so that remains. That's still an issue for them, and Alan Stockdale now has to deal with the critics on that front. It was moderates backing Peter Reith. You've got to get your head around that. Moderates backing Peter Reith, yeah, but that was their complaint, that the party hasn't been managed well, that there hasn't been enough restriction on the operations of the Secretariat, and that they really need to rein it in. So he'll have pressure on him to do that.
Well, after the ballot, the two candidates fronted the microphones. Here they are.
It means a great, great deal to me, and I feel very humbled to have the vote of confidence that this ballot represents. It's made all the more important to me by the fact that my opponent is an icon of the party.
We're on show and we're telling the Australian people that we've had a good discussion, but from now we all work together because we want that other bloke down there, Tony Abbott, to get in.
Now, when you're talking one vote, what made the difference with the one vote? Probably, was it, when the 4 vice presidents, including Alexander Downer, wrote a letter of support for
the oil
Reith?
was... the oil was the night before Reith was sitting well, and then Alexander Downer and 3 other vice presidents wrote a very pointed letter to Stockdale and the other council members saying, you're no good, and raising all these problems in administration, and that was perceived as a step too far. There are certain sort of rules that the Liberals sort of play these things a bit cleaner than Labor.
Yeah, just before you go on with that, we'll hear how Nick Minchin responded to that on an interview on News Radio. Here's Nick Minchin.
All 4 of them have acted with treachery and disloyalty to the incumbent federal president and in a way that brings disrespect upon the Liberal Party and the office of federal president. I've never seen anything like it, and it saddens me that at the end of my 32 years of full-time service to the Liberal Party, we have individuals behaving in this fashion.
Phil?
Well, Nick, of course, was doing the numbers for Stockdale.
In the end of the day,
he had a lot of personal pride in the result, and he's not lost many fights in his career, and that was... look, Nick's done some treacherous things in his time, I'm sure he'd admit, maybe in a few years' time, but he played him off for a break, and the letter did backfire. There's no doubt about it. The talk in the night before the vote was that a few people regarded it as dirty, pulling it probably pushed Stockdale over the line. It got the wrong result.
But in the end, 3 of those vice presidents who signed that letter were returned, so there's still goodwill within the party towards them. They're all just going to have to work together.
I'd like to be at the first meeting with the VPs and the president.
And Phil, a fresh At Home with the Abbotts piece, the kind of piece you usually get during election campaigns, but then we've got a permanent one going.
Tax cuts and family profiles. We're only doing this less than a year ago, but it's, I guess it's indicative of the state of things at the moment.
Permanent election campaign.
Permanent election campaign. Yeah, it's Sam Maiden in the News Limited tabloids. At Home with the Abbotts, Tony in a freshly pressed shirt, pouring a cup of coffee, and how she wears the pants in the house. And
who pressed the shirt? It was a matter of some consternation some time ago.
Her indoors, I'd reckon. But there is quite a significant news story buried within, and that is that with the winter break coming up in Parliament, in July this year, that Abbott, as is his norm, is heading off to an Aboriginal community up on the Cape. He tends to do that most years, but he's taking his wife this time. Tony's
one of his daughters.
Yeah, potentially. And Tony's going to work as a brickies labourer or a builder's labourer, and Margie's going to sort of work with children. So... you can't accuse Abbott of making this stuff up. He's actually sort of fairly genuine about Aboriginal issues and has done this stuff under the radar for a lot of years.
He's done it before, and he says he does it because this sort of fly-in, fly-out thing doesn't work for him. He thinks in that area you've got to take your time and get to know it. Right. And finally, Karen, the 5-cent coin might be on its way out.
Indeed, the 5-cent coin looks like it is on its way out. The Mint has recommended to the government that we ditch the 5-cent coin because it's too expensive. Metal prices being what they are, I don't know whether the echidna is too difficult to print on it, but they say that they think it's a good idea, and Bill Shorten, the Assistant Treasurer, is considering it. There's obviously the question of whether people will feel like they're getting ripped off if prices are going to get rounded up 5 cents, or maybe they'd get rounded down 5 cents. I'm not sure, but it'll be an interesting water cooler debate, I think they call it.
OK, well, that's the Sunday papers, and now the Leader of the Greens, Bob Brown, is about to join us. While he does, we'll hear now from the leaders of the 2 major parties. Julia Gillard confirming she'll deliver tax cuts and increases to family payments and pensions to compensate for a carbon tax, and Tony Abbott promising tax cuts no matter what.